once again, we'd like to turn to Luke 23. Save some time, we'll just read verse 32. And there were also two other malefactors led with him to be put to death. And then verse 40. Verse 39, and one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, Dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? Again, this is Luke's account of Christ being crucified between two thieves. Such was prophesied in Isaiah 53 and verse 12. And all four gospel writers give record of the fact that Christ was crucified with two convicted criminals. On the part of man, that was done to show their disdain for Christ, to manifest what they thought of Christ, that he was just thought of as a criminal. But the bigger picture, on the part of God, this was for the salvation of one of his own, and also on the part of God to provide valuable spiritual lessons for you and I. In these two thieves, we see the condition and the need of all mankind. And in the account, we see the miraculous power of the Lord and his gracious willingness to save unworthy and helpless sinners. So it serves as a pattern of salvation. But in this message, we want to view and apply the passage differently. We want to view this penitent thief as a pattern, not for salvation, but for living life. We'll view him as he is under the influence of the Spirit of God. And viewing him that way, he becomes a pattern for you and I as far as how we should live our lives. So our subject is the penitent thief, a pattern for living life. Need to consider the scene because I believe it's a picture of our world and the conditions in which you and I, the saved, are called to live under. The place, of course, is Calvary. We read in verse 33, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary. Again, Matthew, Mark, and John refer to it as Golgotha. Mark, in his record, Mark 15:22, gave the interpretation of Golgotha, the place of the skull, or the place of death. And that's a picture of the world. It is a place of death. John records in John 19:17 that Golgotha is the Hebrew name. Calvary is the Latin name of this place. We know from Hebrews 13:12 that it was outside the walls of Jerusalem. And we gather from John 19, verses 41 and 42, that there was a burial ground nearby. That would be very convenient, of course. Golgotha, or Calvary, was a place where the Romans would put guilty criminals to death by crucifixion. So it was a place of suffering. So it is with the world. It was a place of distress. It was a place of sorrow. It was a place of heartbreak. It was a place of humiliation. It was a place of indignity. It was a place of disgrace. It was a place of dread. Only one person wanted to go to Calvary, and that was Jesus. It was a place of dread. It was a place of fear. It was a place of absolute horror. It was an appalling and abominable place. And you and I are called to serve God in such a place. The spirit of the scene, we read in verse 48, and all the people that came together to that sight. The gathering consisted of the general public. Some of them would have been there just out of curiosity. There were also the religious and military leaders of the day. There's a mass of people gathered that day, and we read in Matthew 27:36 that some sat down and watched him there. Matthew 27:39, we read that some passed by. And when they passed by, they reviled him. They denounced and slandered him. Luke 23:49, we read of those who stood afar off, beholding these things. So looking at this crowd, we see some are sitting with their focus upon Christ, in disdain for the most part. Some are standing with their focus upon Christ. Some are walking by and their attention is drawn to Christ. The overall spirit and attitude of that crowd was set before the people even arrived at the place, and it increased. The spirit and attitude increased in fervor as the people gathered at this place. So leading up to this scene, Jesus had been betrayed. He had been arrested. He had been bound, led away to Annas, and from there he was led away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where he was questioned concerning the accusations against him. And it was determined that he was guilty of death. And he was spit upon and buffeted and smitten. Caiaphas and the council became enraged at the response of Christ, and the next morning Christ was led away to Pilate, the governor. They said to Pilate, Luke 23:2, "We found this fellow perverting the nation." Again, the spirit and attitude is being set. "And forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." So we see him there in an absolute hatred of Christ. They viewed Christ as a distorter. They viewed Christ as a corrupter. Pilate would then question Christ and declared in verse 4 that I find no fault in this man. I find no crime that he has committed. The response of the people is recorded there in Luke 23 and verse 5. And they were the more fierce. The spirit is growing, the attitude is growing, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." So they were very disturbed at his teaching. Notice the words "more fierce." That is, they became more savage toward Jesus Christ. And again, this is growing in intensity. It's setting the scene for Calvary. It was at this point that Pilate discovers that Jesus belonged to the jurisdiction of Herod. So he sends Christ to Herod, and Herod proceeds to question him, and he also found nothing worthy of death. But then notice in verse 11, "And Herod with his men of war set him at naught." Even though he was not guilty of any crime, they set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. In other words, they considered him to be nothing. You're nobody. You're nobody. And we see that attitude, of course, today. So the Spirit is building. Jesus again is before Pilate. Verse 13, we read, they called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people. And Pilate said, neither do I nor Herod find any fault in this man. We find nothing worthy of death in this man. And Pilate, wanting to set Christ free without compromising himself in the eyes of his superiors, makes reference to a custom that he thought certainly they would go for. And the custom was that a prisoner would be released during the Passover. And since some prisoner must be released and set free, Pilate thinks that this is his opportunity of allowing the innocent Christ to go free. So he offers to chastise Jesus and then set him free and crucify Barabbas, who was at that time the most notorious of all their criminals. But the people in unison cry out in Luke 23:18, away with this man, that is Jesus, and release unto us Barabbas. And Pilate couldn't believe what he was hearing. So he made the offer a second time, and we see in verse 20, Pilate, therefore willing to release Jesus, spake again to them, but they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate then for the third time declared the innocence of Christ, and the people's response is recorded there in verse 23, that they were instant with their voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. They had more respect for a notorious criminal than Jesus Christ. They actually preferred a notorious criminal above Jesus Christ, or to Jesus Christ. And this spirit intensifies, leading to our text. And at this time in Matthew's account, Matthew 27:26, Pilate scourged Jesus and delivered him to be crucified. And notice in Matthew 27, begin reading with verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus in the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. They stripped him, put on him a scarlet robe, and when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him, and mocking him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit upon him, and took the reed, and smote him on the head. And after that they had mocked him, and took the robe off from him, put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. And as the procession heads to the place of crucifixion, again, this attitude, this spirit toward Christ is intensifying. There are people in front, there are people behind, they are hurrying the procession along, and the whole scene is filled with disdain and hate and scorn, the malice and the disgust at the person of Jesus Christ, the hostility, the derision and contempt toward Christ was building each step of the way. And again, these people had more respect for Barabbas than the two thieves than they did for Christ. The spirit of the scene is one of Antichrist. That's the spirit of the world, by the way. The spirit of the world is the spirit of Antichrist. It is a spirit of darkness. It is a spirit of uncleanness. It is a spirit of lies, a spirit of ignorance, a spirit of rejection, and the spirit that finds Christ to be an annoyance and an irritation. We just want him gone. Want him gone. Remove him. And that's the world that we live in. The activity of the scene, there are three crosses. Two of them are two low-down thieves, and upon the center cross is Jesus, the Son of God. As the people watch, and as they stand and behold, and as they pass by, all eyes are directed to that center cross. And that one on the center cross, Jesus Christ, is more despised, more hated than the two thieves on either side. There's far more scorn, far more disgust, far more hostility and animosity toward Jesus on that cross than the other two thieves. And they consider the one on the center cross to be far worse than the two thieves. He's more intolerable than the two thieves. And they mock and they taunt and they ridicule and they curse the one upon that center cross. But not only were those sitting there and those who were standing there and those who were passing by showing their disdain for Christ, but the thieves also are doing the same thing. Again, Matthew 27:44, the thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. So it was a scene of mass irreverence. That's the spirit of this scene. Just irreverence everywhere. Everywhere you turn, there was irreverence. Now, there were some in the crowd, his mother, there were others, John. They weren't caught up in that spirit, but the overall spirit was a spirit of irreverence. So then consider, it was just a full-scale assault upon Christ. It's demonic rage is what you have there. And it's intensifying by the hour. And I believe that's where we are today. So consider this one thief. He's our pattern in this scene. He came under the influence of the almighty power of God. And if you and I are going to live and serve God in such a setting, in such a scene, we must be under the influence of Almighty God. That's the only way. That's the only way not to get caught up in the world scene, is to be under the influence of God. We have this exhortation in Ephesians 5:18, be filled with the Spirit. There's no other way. There's no other way to live in this world. If we're going to live for God and serve God in this setting and scene, we must have a continual, ongoing, perpetual overflow of the Spirit of God. We must be under the power, the influence, the effect, and the sway of the Spirit of God. This thief, in the setting and scene of Golgotha, or Calvary, was hearing and he was witnessing firsthand the hatred, the ridicule, the blasphemy spewing forth toward Christ. We witness it firsthand today. But he had come under the influence of the power of God. And as a result, he rose above that spirit. He rose above the activity of that day. He came under the influence of the almighty power of God, and he manifested a difference in his spirit and than the spirit and activity of that day. And here we are. We live in a day when the masses shrug off God, shrug off the message of God, have no interest, shrug off the day of God. Even God's people, those who profess to be God's people, they think nothing of the Lord's day. They're satisfied with spiritual mediocrity and hypocrisy, mechanical religion. It is a day of self. How do we survive that? We have to be under the influence of Almighty God. The world is in opposition. The world is antagonistic. The world is a detriment to the life that you and I are called to live and are responsible to live. We must be under the influence of Almighty God. As a result of this man being under the influence of the almighty power of God, he was of a completely different mindset. Again, we're viewing him as he comes under the influence of the Lord, not before that. And he was of a different mindset. Prior to coming under the influence of the almighty power of God, he belonged to that atmosphere. He belonged to the spirit of Golgotha. But coming under the working of his mighty power, he's no longer sucked in by the evil influence all around him. If you do not have the fullness of the Spirit of God, you will be sucked in. Maybe not all the way, but you will be sucked in by this world. He was no longer governed. Once he came under the influence of the power of God, he was no longer governed. He was no longer being molded and shaped by the spirit and activity that was all around him. His entire thought process has changed, and it's different than all those around him. And we hear him say, this man hath done nothing amiss. The polar opposite thought process of the masses of that day. For the most part, the crowd that gathered that day were blasphemers. But in a perverted twist, they make Christ to be the blasphemer. Just look around today. The perverted twist that people make, it's just amazing. And how do we prevent getting caught up in that? Come under the influence, the almighty power of God. The power of God upon our lives will prevent us from being taken in and engulfed by the evil influence and ways around us and the vileness of the times. It'll give us a different mindset from the ways and the reasonings and the philosophies and the conclusions. The world's conclusions, you want to talk about twisted? They don't even make sense. There's no connection. The thief in this setting, in the setting of and scene of Golgotha, he was hearing, he was witnessing the hatred, the ridicule, the blasphemy. He was surrounded by it. He was bombarded by it. But having come under the influence of the power of God, he was not only of a different mindset, but he had courage. He had courage to speak his mindset. He had courage. He had courage to rebuke the other thief. And in rebuking the other thief, he was also rebuking those who were part of that mob. He had the courage to speak in reverence toward God. He had courage. All because he was under the influence of the power of God. He had courage in the midst of mass irreverence. We need to be a people of courage. We need to be a people of audacity, to speak up for the glory of God, even in the midst of irreverence. We hear him say, in the midst of abomination, dost not thou fear God? He had the courage. I don't even believe he thought about it. He just spoke. He's in that scene, he's in the setting of hatred toward Christ. ridicule toward Christ, blasphemy toward Christ. But he's of a different mindset, and he has a courageous spirit to speak. He also recognized sin as a terrible thing. Notice verse 41. And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. He realized that sin was a terrible thing. He was not indifferent towards sin, whether it be his own or others. The power of God upon our lives will not allow us to continue in sin. It will not allow us to deny sin. It will not allow us to ignore it, to excuse it, to justify it, to minimize it. Coming under the influence of God, you cannot do those things. The influence of God will not allow it. But instead, it causes us to confess it and to hate it and to turn from it. So this thief, under the influence of his mighty power, he did not attempt to redefine sin, give sin a different name, and give sin all the names you want. Doesn't change it. You can call a cow a dog. A cow's still a cow, no matter what you call it. But he viewed sin in the light of this man. We indeed justly, but this man. He didn't view sin in the light of the spirit and attitude that he was surrounded by. He viewed sin in the light of this man. And that's how we have to view sin as well. You speak up about sin, people say, oh, that's hate speech. That you realize the times have changed. You view sin in light of who Christ is, not in light of what society is, not in light of the spirit and attitude of the day. So this thief, under the influence of God, finds the taunts out of the other thief to be very frightening. As we look around today, it's very frightening how sin is presented. If we come under the influence of the Spirit of God, we realize what sin is, regardless of what society says. So this man had a different mindset. He had courage. He recognized sin. He stood against it. He also called attention to Christ. It was in the setting and scene of Golgotha, in the very midst of the spirit of Antichrist, that this man in verse 41 unashamedly said, "But this man hath done nothing amiss." In the setting and scene of Golgotha, he spoke of the perfection of Jesus Christ. This man, in the midst of darkness and ignorance and blindness and hatred and demonic rage. And that's what it was at the cross. It was demonic rage. And we've seen it ourselves in the world today. It's demonic rage. But this man, in the midst of that, called attention to Christ. And that's what we always need to be doing. You call attention to Christ. Well, that's just going to make them matter. Yeah, probably. But you just call attention to Christ. John in 1 John 4:3 spoke of the spirit of Antichrist, and then he declares, even now already is it in the world. It was in the world when John was alive. And it was in the world before that. That is the spirit of the world. Antichrist. And the spirit of Antichrist, again, finds Christ to be an annoyance. He's an inconvenience. He interferes with our life. He's a bother. He's an irritation. He's a problem. He's an aggravation. We can put up with the thief more than we can put up with him. And we live in such a world. And just like this man who had come under the influence of God's almighty working power, we must call attention to Jesus Christ, because He is the answer. We hear Him say in a completely different tone of the hour, this man. This man. We have to make sure that our tone never becomes the tone that's all around us. But our tone is this man. This man. He was not ashamed to acknowledge Christ as Lord, His Lord, and His King. We see that in verse 42. In the setting and scene of Golgotha, we need to be a people that speak with clarity and plainness. He's my King. He's my King. Don't have to think about it. Don't have to ponder it. He's my King. So here we are living in the setting and scene of Golgotha. Know that God would work mightily within us, causing us in the midst of hatred and ridicule and blasphemy and a fierce malice, in the midst of that which is demonic, point to Jesus and say, He's my King. He's my King. And the spirit and the attitude that is everywhere around us does not change this fact. He is my King. And then we see also that He was not ashamed to be identified with Jesus Christ. The vast majority, not everybody, but the vast majority of the crowd that had gathered that day loudly attacked and denounced Christ. They were openly rebellious, openly defiant toward Christ. But this man, having come under the influence of the almighty power of God, looks toward Christ and says, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Notice two important words, Lord, me. Lord, me. He is saying, Jesus is my King, and He has a kingdom, and that kingdom is not of this world. And I want to be identified with Him as King and be a part of that kingdom. We have to always remember what kingdom we're living in. Don't ever forget that. This world's not our home. Not a citizen here. We live in His kingdom. So we see this man becomes a pattern for us in the midst of horrible conditions and a demonic spirit. This man, having come under the influence of God, becomes a pattern for us. He rises above all that's going on. Today, we're not happy with what we see going on all around us. Oh, it doesn't make us happy. But it shouldn't get us so down in the dumps that we forget why we're here. We're here to serve Him. We're here to point to Jesus Christ. We're here to stand for Him and to do so, not getting caught up in the same tone as those all around us. Not only is our mindset different, our tone is to be different as well. So many get caught up in it, and the reason is they're not under the influence of the Spirit of God. That's what we need as God's people, to come under the mighty working influence of God. Brother David.